why do we bother sending a whole bunch of stuff up to space? It's that energy is essentially 24/7 and free with solar power using solar arrays. It's that cooling is, in a way, a simpler problem. While it's cold, you can't use fans. So one of the challenges with cooling is in space, there's not air, so you can't use connected cooling like a fan. You need to use radiative cooling, and so that will require a large amount of metal. So we're going to have to figure out how to do cooling in a way that makes sense in space. And we're going to have to send up chips. So we're going to have to create chips that we can ship up to space and create clusters that can do the heavy compute. But if we do that, we no longer need to deal with permitting. We no longer need to deal with wiring large numbers of cables. We can use lasers and optics in a way that we can't use as easily. The light moves 40% slower through a fiber optic cable than it does through the vacuum of space. So there's a lot of advantages. There's also a lot of costs with sending a bunch of material up to space and creating a inference cluster. But that's what some are proposing.
I'm looking at this whole thing and I think it's like really exciting and cool. The thing is like, we already have so many like satellites up in space and this is a 4 kilometer square that's to float around and not hit anything. So like the first principles of like, yeah, like assume this is the only thing up there. Like it generally makes sense. Like, okay, yeah, there's a technology gap of like, I'm sure there are going to be plenty of companies that figure out like the space radiator or like the like connection system or like common protocols for figuring out how to connect my like data center module to an existing grid, right? But there is so much like that could possibly go wrong up there relative to down here because it's ultimately like free objects floating in free space that like the radiators have to take up mass and can't be pointed towards the sun, right? The 4 kilometer square is like, we already have so many satellites up in space. Like you mentioned like permitting, Shashi, but like who we're getting to a point that like Starlink is shipping so many things up into space. And it's becoming very common that like people will create satellites or companies will create satellites for sets of purposes. We're still early. But what happens when like lower orbits get crowded, right? Like what is the zone in which 4 kilometer squares are allowed versus the zone in which like my like random like Boy Scout like cyberpunk project of 2050 is allowed to hover up there for a little bit, right? Like you end up like creating like a lot of real risk if everyone wants to talk about AGI and we want to talk about like this is going to be serving like all these use cases, like we can't really afford to have those things like breaking spontaneously, and that means like a random rock hitting a solar panel at the wrong angle could send this thing like shattering into thousands of other things across orbit.